Her autistic son taught the billionaire how to listen. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling Tower, 47 floors above the bustling streets of Manhattan. Adrian Sterling stood motionless, his reflection merging with the grey cityscape beyond. At 38, he commanded a financial empire worth $12 billion, yet the silence in his corner office felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering outside. His secretary had left an hour ago, the trading floor had emptied, and now even the cleaning crew worked quietly in distant corridors. Adrian's phone buzzed incessantly on his mahogany desk, displaying notifications from investors, board members, and executives from 3 different continents. Each message represented millions in potential profits or losses, decisions that could reshape entire markets. He glanced at the screen displaying real-time stock fluctuations, his company's shares climbing steadily, despite the economic uncertainty plaguing smaller firms. Success had become as predictable as breathing, yet somehow felt just as mechanical. Meanwhile, across the city in a modest apartment in Queens, Isabella Martinez was experiencing her own version of evening quiet. She sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, watching her 8-year-old son Leo trace invisible patterns in the air with his fingers. The apartment was small, but carefully organized. Every corner designed to provide comfort and predictability for Leo's unique needs. Soft lighting replaced harsh fluorescence, and textured fabrics in muted blues and greens covered the furniture, creating a sensory-friendly environment that had taken Isabella years to perfect. Leo had been non-verbal since birth, existing in a world that others struggled to understand. While most children his age chattered endlessly about cartoons and playground adventures, Leo communicated through intricate drawings that filled notebook after notebook. His latest creation lay open beside him, a spiral of interconnected circles and lines that seemed to pulse with meaning only he could decipher. Isabella had learned to read these visual stories, recognizing joy in the curved lines, anxiety in sharp angles, and peace in the flowing patterns that resembled ocean waves. The contrast between their evenings was stark. Adrian's silence was chosen, a barrier he'd constructed to maintain control and distance. Isabella's silence with Leo was shared, a language they'd developed together through necessity and deep love. Where Adrian saw Leo's condition as a communication failure, Isabella had discovered an entirely different way of connecting with another human being. Adrian's assistant had mentioned something about a charity commitment scheduled for the following week. Some community center initiative the board had approved for tax benefits and positive publicity. He'd barely listened during the briefing, assuming it would involve the usual routine, a brief appearance, some photos for the company newsletter, perhaps a ceremonial check presentation. These obligations were simply part of the business landscape, necessary performances that maintained his company's public image while requiring minimal personal investment. Isabella was preparing for that same week, helping Leo organize his art supplies for the Tuesday session at the Harmony Community Center. The center had become their sanctuary, a place where Leo could express himself freely among other children who understood difference as simply another way of being. Isabella watched as Leo carefully arranged his colored pencils by shade, a ritual that brought him visible comfort. She knew that any disruption to this routine could trigger hours of distress, so she participated in these preparations with the patience of someone who had learned that love sometimes meant slowing down to match another person's pace. The rain continued its relentless percussion against windows throughout the city, but in these 2 separate spaces, it created entirely different atmospheres. In Adrian's tower, it emphasized his isolation, the sound echoing off marble floors and glass surfaces with cold precision. In Isabella's apartment, the same rain felt cozy and protective, muffled by curtains and absorbed by the soft furnishings that made their home a gentle refuge from a world that often felt too loud, too fast, and too demanding for children like Leo. Neither Adrian nor Isabella could have imagined that within days their carefully constructed worlds would intersect in ways that would fundamentally alter both their perspectives. The billionaire who had mastered the art of making people listen was about to meet the child who would teach him something far more valuable: how to truly hear. The Harmony Community Center buzzed with nervous energy as staff members prepared for Adrian Sterling's visit. Located in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, the center served families from diverse backgrounds, offering everything from after-school programs to support groups for parents of children with special needs. The building's exposed brick walls were covered with colorful artwork created by the children, and the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the aroma of homemade cookies that volunteers had prepared for the occasion. Isabella arrived early with Leo, hoping to help him adjust to the anticipated changes in routine. She knew that having strangers in their safe space could be overwhelming for him, and she'd spent the weekend preparing him with visual schedules and social stories about visitors coming to see their community. Leo clutched his newest notebook, filled with drawings he'd completed over the past few days. The patterns seemed more complex lately, with intricate geometric designs that reminded Isabella of architectural blueprints or city maps viewed from above. Adrian's black sedan pulled up precisely at 10 a.m., followed by a smaller vehicle carrying his photographer and assistant. He emerged wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most families spent on rent, his expression reflecting the mild irritation of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing a passion. The center's director, Maria Santos, greeted him warmly, launching into prepared remarks about their programs and the children they served. Adrian nodded politely, while mentally calculating how long he needed to stay to satisfy the publicity requirements. The tour began in the main activity room, where Adrian was introduced to various programs and shown displays of the children's achievements. He shook hands with volunteers, posed for photos with staff members, and listened to statistics about the center's impact on the community. Everything proceeded according to the script his assistant had outlined, until they reached the quiet corner where Leo sat at a low table, completely absorbed in his drawing. Maria approached Leo's table with gentle enthusiasm, hoping to showcase one of their most dedicated participants. "Mr. Sterling, I'd like you to meet Leo Martinez and his mother Isabella. Leo is one of our most talented young artists." Isabella stood and extended her hand with a warm but cautious smile, immediately sensing Adrian's discomfort with the deviation from his structured tour. Leo continued drawing, seemingly unaware of the adults gathering around his table. Adrian looked down at the boy, expecting the typical interaction he'd experienced with other children during corporate events. Excited chatter, requests for autographs, maybe some shy questions about his success. Instead, Leo remained focused on his notebook, his pencil moving in deliberate strokes across the paper. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Adrian waited for acknowledgement that never came. "Hello, Leo," Adrian said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used in boardrooms. Leo's pencil paused momentarily, but he didn't look up. Adrian tried again, this time crouching down to Leo's eye level. "That's an interesting drawing. Can you tell me about it?" Still no response. The boy's focus remained entirely on his artwork, as if Adrian simply didn't exist in his carefully ordered world. Isabella felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She'd witnessed this scenario countless times. Well-meaning adults trying to force Leo into conventional social interactions, growing frustrated when he didn't respond according to their expectations. "Leo experiences the world differently," she explained gently. "He's autistic and nonverbal, but he communicates in his own beautiful ways." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. In his world, communication was currency, and silence was either defiance or incompetence. He'd built his fortune on reading people, on understanding what they wanted and how to provide it for maximum profit. This child's apparent indifference challenged everything he understood about human interaction. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, thinking perhaps a game or video might capture Leo's attention. "Would you like to see something cool on my phone?" Adrian asked, opening a colorful app. Leo's pencil continued its methodical movement across the paper. Adrian tried showing him photos of luxury cars, impressive buildings, even videos of fireworks displays. Nothing seemed to penetrate Leo's concentration. The other adults watched awkwardly as one of the world's most powerful men struggled to connect with an 8-year-old boy. Isabella observed Adrian's growing frustration with a mixture of empathy and protective concern. She'd seen this pattern before. Adults who approached Leo expecting conventional responses, then interpreted his natural way of being as rudeness or disability. But there was something different about Adrian's persistence, a desperation beneath his polished exterior that suggested this interaction mattered more to him than he was willing to admit. The photographer captured several shots of Adrian attempting to engage with Leo, but even he seemed to sense that these weren't the heartwarming images the company had hoped for. The silence in the room grew heavier, punctuated only by the soft scratching of Leo's pencil against paper and the distant sounds of other children playing in adjacent rooms. Finally, Adrian stood up, his frustration barely concealed behind his professional facade. He looked at Isabella with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been genuine curiosity. "How do you communicate with him?" he asked, and for the first time that morning, his voice lacked its usual commanding confidence. Isabella looked at Adrian's question hanging in the air, recognizing something vulnerable beneath his polished exterior. "Would you like me to show you?" she asked, settling back down beside Leo's table. Adrian hesitated for a moment, glancing at his watch and then at his assistant, who was frantically typing notes on her tablet. Something about Isabella's calm presence made him nod and lower himself back into the small plastic chair beside the table. "The first thing you need to understand," Isabella began, her voice soft but clear, "is that Leo isn't ignoring you. He's processing everything around him, but his brain works differently than ours. Watch his hands." She pointed to Leo's fingers as they moved across the paper, and Adrian noticed for the first time the deliberate precision of each stroke, the way the boy's entire body seemed to flow with the rhythm of his creation. Isabella reached across the table and gently placed her fingertip on the edge of Leo's notebook, not interrupting his work, but simply making her presence known. Leo's eyes flicked toward her finger for just a moment before returning to his drawing, but his posture relaxed slightly. "See that?" Isabella whispered. "He acknowledged me, but in his own way. He knows I'm here, and he knows I respect what he's doing." Adrian found himself leaning forward, studying the interaction with the same intensity he brought to analyzing market trends. He noticed how Isabella's breathing seemed to synchronize with Leo's, how she waited for natural pauses in his drawing before speaking, how her voice maintained a consistent, calming tone that never demanded immediate attention. "Leo experiences the world through patterns and textures," Isabella continued, her hand moving slowly toward a basket of textured fabric squares on the table. "These aren't just random shapes to him. They're stories, emotions, entire conversations that most of us never learn to read." She selected a piece of corduroy and placed it near Leo's free hand. Without looking away from his drawing, Leo's fingers found the fabric and began tracing its ridged surface. For Adrian, this moment felt like watching a foreign language being translated in real time. He observed how Leo's facial expression shifted subtly as he touched the corduroy, a barely perceptible softening around his eyes that suggested contentment. "He's happy," Adrian said, surprised by his own ability to recognize the emotion. "Exactly," Isabella smiled. "And now, watch this." She moved her hand slowly toward Leo's notebook, not to touch it, but to cast a shadow across part of his drawing. Leo's pencil stopped immediately, and he looked directly at the shadow, then at Isabella's hand, then back to his work. He adjusted his position slightly to work around the shadow rather than asking her to move. He problem-solved, Adrian observed, his business mind automatically cataloguing the interaction. He adapted his approach without losing focus on his goal. Isabella nodded, pleased that Adrian was beginning to see Leo's capabilities rather than his limitations. That's exactly right. Leo is constantly processing and adapting, just not in ways most people recognize. His intelligence is profound, but it operates through different channels. The room had grown quieter, with even Maria and the photographer unconsciously lowering their voices as they witnessed this unexpected lesson unfolding. Adrian found himself studying Leo with renewed interest, noticing details he'd missed before. The way the boy's breathing remained steady and calm, how his left hand occasionally tapped out a rhythm against his leg while his right hand drew, the precise way he selected each colored pencil without looking at the options. Try sitting in silence for a minute, Isabella suggested. Don't try to get his attention or make him respond. Just exist in the same space and observe what he's actually doing rather than what you think he should be doing. Adrian's instinct was to protest that he didn't have time for such exercises, but something about the challenge intrigued him. In boardrooms, he was accustomed to dominating conversations, filling every pause with strategic words designed to influence and control. The concept of productive silence was foreign to his experience, yet he found himself accepting Isabella's guidance. As Adrian settled into stillness, the ambient sounds of the center became more apparent. He could hear children laughing in the distance, the hum of fluorescent lights, the subtle scratching of Leo's pencil, and his own heartbeat. For perhaps the first time in decades, Adrian wasn't planning his next move or anticipating outcomes. He was simply present, and in that presence, he began to notice things that had been invisible to him before. Leo's drawing was evolving into something extraordinary. What had appeared to be random lines were revealing themselves as an intricate cityscape, complete with buildings, bridges, and flowing patterns that might have been rivers or roads. The level of detail was stunning, far beyond what Adrian would have expected from any 8-year-old, let alone one who couldn't speak. 3 weeks had passed since Adrian's first visit to the Harmony Community Center, yet he found himself returning every Tuesday morning, drawn by something he couldn't quite articulate to his bewildered staff. His assistant had initially scheduled these visits as brief photo opportunities, but Adrian kept extending his stays, cancelling meetings, and rearranging his schedule in ways that defied his usual ruthless efficiency. Wall Street Journal articles about his mysterious Tuesday absences had begun circulating, with analysts speculating about secret mergers or hidden health issues. The truth was far simpler and more profound than any financial journalist could have imagined. Adrian was learning a new language, one that didn't rely on words, quarterly reports, or market projections. Under Isabella's patient guidance, he'd begun to understand that Leo's silence wasn't empty space, waiting to be filled, but rather a different form of fullness that required a completely different kind of attention. On this particular Tuesday, Adrian arrived to find Leo working on what appeared to be his most ambitious drawing yet. The notebook had been replaced by a large sheet of paper spread across 2 tables, and Leo was creating something that resembled a detailed architectural plan. Adrian settled into his usual chair beside the table, no longer attempting to initiate conversation, but instead watching the careful progression of Leo's work. Isabella approached with 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Adrian before settling into her own chair. "He's been working on this for 5 days," she said quietly. "I think it might be his interpretation of the city as he experiences it through our weekly walks." Adrian studied the drawing more closely and realized that Leo had captured elements of their neighborhood with startling accuracy. The curves of the bridge they crossed to reach the center, the angular patterns of fire escapes on apartment buildings, even the organic shapes of trees in the small park where they sometimes stopped to rest. "How does he remember all these details?" Adrian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd learned that sudden loud sounds could startle Leo, disrupting his concentration for extended periods. "Leo sees everything," Isabella replied. "His brain doesn't filter out details the way ours do. Where we might notice the general shape of a building, he sees every window, every shadow, every texture. It can be overwhelming for him, which is why he needs quiet spaces to process all that information. Adrian found himself thinking about his own relationship with detail and observation. In business, he prided himself on seeing opportunities others missed, on noticing subtle market patterns that predicted future trends. Yet watching Leo work, he realized that his own observational skills were crude instruments compared to the boy's profound sensitivity to his environment. As Leo continued drawing, Adrian noticed something that made his breath catch. The boy was incorporating elements that couldn't have come from their neighborhood walks. The distinctive geometric pattern of the Sterling Tower's facade, the unique curved entrance of Adrian's building. Details that Leo could only have observed during their brief car rides to and from the center. Somehow, in those few minutes of travel, Leo had absorbed and internalized architectural features that most adults would never notice. "He drew my building," Adrian said, pointing to the recognizable structure emerging in one corner of Leo's cityscape. Isabella leaned closer, her eyes widening with surprise and delight. "He's including you in his world," she said softly. This is how Leo shows affection and connection. He doesn't use words like, "I like you," or "you're important to me." Instead, he makes you part of his visual story. The realization hit Adrian with unexpected force. This child, whom he'd initially seen as broken or incomplete, had been paying attention to him all along. Leo had been listening in his own way, absorbing not just the physical details of Adrian's world, but finding ways to integrate those elements into his own creative expression. The drawing wasn't just a representation of the neighborhood. It was Leo's way of saying that Adrian belonged in his carefully ordered universe. Isabella watched Adrian's face transform as understanding dawned. "For 3 weeks, you've been learning to communicate with Leo," she said. "But what you might not realize is that he's been communicating with you, too. Every drawing he's made during your visits has included elements from your world. The tall buildings, the patterns of your tie, even the way rain looks different when viewed from high windows." Adrian felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. In boardrooms around the world, he'd been praised for his ability to read people, to understand their motivations and desires. Yet here was a child who had been reading him with far greater depth and accuracy, seeing not just his external success, but somehow perceiving the person beneath the corporate armor. Leo's pencil paused, and he looked directly at Adrian for the first time since they'd met. The eye contact lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a conversation, an acknowledgement that transcended the need for words. In that brief moment, Adrian understood that he'd been searching for connection in all the wrong places, demanding responses instead of offering presence, talking when he should have been listening. The transformation was complete, though Adrian wouldn't fully grasp its implications until much later. He'd entered the center as a man who believed that communication meant commanding attention and controlling conversations. He was leaving as someone who understood that the most profound exchanges often happened in silence, that true connection required not the ability to make others listen, but the wisdom to listen deeply oneself.